Have you ever heard the theory about white flight
Yes.
from the city to the Yeah, but the theory
Right.
about why it happened. The city to the suburbs to other suburbs.
I don't know. In Detroit, they said it happened after the '68 riots, that the white flight and all the TV stations left Detroit and they're all in the burbs.
Yeah, but the theory about it, not the description of what happened. One theory is sort of nicely encapsulated rhythmically as magic dirt became tragic dirt. So the magic dirt of the suburbs, where people were fleeing the problems of the urban centers for the leafy suburbs to pursue their own American dreams, better schools, safer neighborhoods, and the like. And when minority families did the same thing after white families had fled to the suburbs, the theory goes, they were left holding the bag. The minority families, the black and Latino families, when they fled to the suburbs. And so when we talk about what happened to South Suburban Chicagoland, for example, the argument would be, well, ethnic whites left the city for the South suburbs, and then Latino and black families, particularly in the Southland situation, black families started to move to the South suburbs, and that led those white ethnic families to then move to collar counties like Will or Northwest Indiana. And what they left behind was the magic dirt that they found became tragic dirt because they left behind aging infrastructure and it's not the wherewithal that they had come to find and build upon when they first made the move. That explains the migratory pattern, and it also explains why once thriving South suburban communities, think Flossmore and Olympia Fields, no longer such thriving communities. Yeah, I gotta get more context to this because I'm highly skeptical. But let's have that conversation. To help us do that, please be joined by Benjamin Herold. He's an award-winning journalist and author of the book Disillusioned, Five Families and the Unraveling of America's Suburbs. Benjamin Herold, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
So do I have that magic dirt, tragic dirt theory properly described?
Yeah, I think you actually did a really great job of that. I appreciated hearing it in your words. And I think that the one place where I reframe it just a little bit is the idea that it's the dirt, it's the land itself. Because I think really what we see in a lot of these communities is it's the infrastructure. And that infrastructure is built with lots of government subsidy, but that same subsidy isn't available to maintain and repair it moving on. And that's where you kind of get the switch from magic to tragic.
I develop that more for me, for us, how it works, in your estimation. I mean, and I don't know what your familiarity is with Chicagoland, so if there's another regional example, but just to make it sort of concrete, pun intended, how it happens that you have big city migration in sort of racial groups, one after the other, and there's investment in infrastructure, and then, well, the whites move on, and then there's disinvestment in infrastructure and a real world vignette that highlights that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in a inner ring suburb of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I write about this in the book. It's a town called Penn Hills, and it's kind of your prototypical post-World War II bedroom community. It had been farmlands and coal mines, and then all of a sudden, more or less overnight, it became subdivisions full of single-family homes. And when my family moved in the mid-'70s, it was still almost 90% white, and it was still a place that worked really, really well for families like mine. So it worked well in terms of, you can still get cheap mortgage loans, there's big tax breaks for suburban homeowners, but also most of the infrastructure was still new, and the public schools worked really well. And they worked really well because they had been built in our own image. They reflected the values, interest, history, culture of families like mine. And so to give you an example of how this kind of deterioration over time happens and how that ends up having a racial dimension to it is as early as the 1950s, like as the town, the suburban town outside of Pittsburgh is still developing, people start warning, hey, you have a big problem with the sewer system here. It's kind of a slapdash system. There's a whole neighborhoods that are missing treatment plants. There's raw sewage that's leaking into the ground going to the river. And you have both planning experts and residents, citizens saying you have a real problem here. This is a health risk and this is a legal risk. And the town ignored it because it would have been really, really expensive to fix. And it ignored it for decades. And so my family, like when I lived in Penn Hills, this was all happening then, but we didn't pay to repair the system because we were kicking the can down the road. And eventually the bill for that comes due. And in my hometown of Penn Hills, what that looked like is the EPA and state environmental regulators getting involved and saying, there's 13,000 violations of the Clean Water Act here, and fining the township almost $1 million and demanding $60 million in repairs. And so it was the residents who lived there after my family left who ended up having to pay for that. So that's this idea of how it kind of, the kind of dream deteriorates in real time with this demographic shift laid over it. Because when I graduated Penn Hills in 1994, it was said the public schools were 72% white. By the time all of this really hit and the damage was done, the public schools were almost 2/3 black.
Yeah, but kicking the can down the road is not racial. That's almost everybody does that. White, black. I mean, every level of government kicking the can down the road. I mean, that should be the motto of government in America. So I mean, right? So like for
interject, but you're exactly right. Like that's the whole point. Like that's the whole point. And it's not, the argument that I make in the book is it's not a critique of individual decisions. And again, my own family is involved in this. So we did this and it was a rational decision for me and my family. The problem is when you aggregate those rational individual decisions up to a sociological level, you get this pattern that leaves a lot of families stuck.
So is that why you decided to move? Because that payday was coming?
What you see in a lot of these kind of aging suburbs where this, you see the changes start to happen. And this is true in Penn Hills. And, I followed 4 other suburban communities around the country. You see it again and again, is that there's almost like this kind of like ambient anxiety that starts to permeate a town. You start to see roads aren't getting fixed. Test scores in the school system start to go down. Home values start to stagnate. The sidewalks and sewers aren't getting fixed, repairs. So you start to see all of these or feel all of these changes, but we don't connect the dots. We don't have a larger way of making sense of it. All we know is like, hey, this isn't what I thought it was. I should get out while I still can. And again, that's a rational, normal decision for families who are living it in your own bubble. But the problem is when that's all happening, when it's kind of happening at a wholesale level with tens of thousands of people moving out, being replaced by tens of thousands of people moving in. And those people moving in are expecting that same generous social contract with new infrastructure, lots of, financial benefits, et cetera. But what they end up finding is not only are they not getting that same deal, but they end up paying for the stuff that helped everyone who came before them get so many opportunities.
Yeah, but I mean, realistically, it is a very small percentage of the residents of any community, regardless of race, that has any idea other than physical manifestations of it, like potholes, what the underlying infrastructure, the water and sewer infrastructure and major projects, and are we going to have to, level up a bond issue? I mean, the percentage of people who have that level of sophistication or even interest in understanding municipal government, a regional government, is infinitesimal. That's why I just like the racial component. I mean, for example, let me just counter your Penn Hill example with Chicagoland. So the south suburbs of Chicagoland, which we talk about a lot, you heard me mentioning it at the outset. I mean, it was the two suburban communities, Flossmore and Olympia Fields. 50 years ago now, the late 60s, they were two of the wealthiest communities in Chicagoland, along with North Shore communities that are more familiar to people outside Chicago, that still are some of the wealthiest. Flossmore and Olympia Fields no longer on the list because not so much because of white flight or because of black families moving in from the suburbs, because that happens over time. It doesn't flip a switch, but because of terrible public policy decisions like the property tax classification system in Cook County that destroyed the commercial tax base in South Suburban Cook County, and then came after the residential because there was no commercial base. And so you're paying the highest property taxes as a percentage of home value, some of the highest in America, black, white, Latino, whatever. It's just you can't make the math make sense. And then you add on what they did in Chicago, these same policymakers, black, white, and Latino, when they tore down the public housing projects and they wanted to scatter site the residents around the suburbs, and a disproportionate percentage of former public housing residents were sent to South Suburban communities. And if you go back and look at stories from the Chicago Tribune and other outlets in the late 60s and early 70s, you'll have black residents. You have in these stories black residents of Roseland neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, which was a middle income, predominantly black community that was safe and prosperous. And they're saying, wait a second, don't send those people to our community because they don't have the socialization to be property owners and to take care and to contribute. You can't just dump these people into our community. It's not going to be productive for our community. This was black residents, middle income residents, families talking about largely black residents being shipped from the city to the suburbs. So I'm just using those as two examples to say those public policy decisions, I would argue, had so much more impact on the decimation of South Suburban Chicagoland than sort of the racial the racial problems we had, of course, the discrimination issues. I acknowledge all of that. But those public policy issues is what put families moving into the south suburbs after the initial flight from Chicago much more behind the eight ball than anything that this magic soil, tragic soil could explain.
Yeah, I think you're making a really great point there about the public policy dimension of this, and I couldn't agree with you more on that. That there is this really what I see as both short-sighted and kind of counterproductive policy that really drove a lot of the post-war suburban growth. And so what you see, the example that you're saying really resonates with me, because I think what you see is kind of two things. Like we have kind of developed this mindset that if our neighborhood starts to change, if the demographics change, if things start to age and it needs repair, if the basic kind of underlying foundation, we realize the foundational kind of principles of the community aren't really working anymore. What we've been encouraged to do is leave and leave for a newer suburb further out, or increasingly going back into the city if you're able to. And so you have that kind of policy decision, which is not explicitly racial or explicitly racist. It's a reflection of this mindset. But what ends up happening, and I think you make a great point, that there's a strong class dimension to that too. So, I followed an African-American family in the Atlanta suburbs for the book, for example, and they made the same progression. They said, listen, we're going to go out to the newest, furthest place from downtown we can, because that's where we think the schools are best. And they looked at the same thing everyone else looked at. What are the test scores? What are the crime rates? What are the, neighborhood safety scores? All of those kinds of things. So it's a very American thing, but that's part of the problem, is that, we have created all of these communities based on that mindset, grounded in this flawed public policy. And now we're kind of having to deal with the fact that not only did it not work, but it hasn't worked on a massive scale.
But then how do you explain what you just mentioned? You just made reference to gentrification of the cities. So then people come back to the cities, whether they're empty nesters or kids out of college or what have you. They want to just live in a bigger city for the arts and entertainment diversity, and you see all this gentrification going on until so many of these cities essentially lost control of public safety, and then the flight now has. And lockdowns during COVID, of course. And so now the flight is moving out of those cities and the gentrification has stalled. But there was that gentrification. So they came back to what would be, according to your paradigm, tragic soil, and made it magic soil. And then they left again.
Yeah, and I think, you had kind of opened the segment by talking about the kind of cycles and patterns of white flight, and staying away from even what are the intentions of it, just the, kind of from a sociological perspective, the dynamics of it. I think what we've really seen, particularly in the last, 10, 20 years, it's almost like when you have the wave in the bathtub. It kind of comes down, hits the end of the tub, and then kind of sweeps back. And so you do see a lot of families, and we have seen a lot of, younger families, more affluent families, especially highly educated families, moving back into cities. And so, but part of what, when we step back and see it from, the 30,000 foot view, the kind of common thread in all of these dynamics is people trying to run away from the problems we've left behind, or from the people we don't want to share communities with and schools with and neighborhoods with. And so that migration pattern has gone off lots of different directions, but the underlying principle, I think, largely remains the same.
He is Benjamin Herold. He's an award-winning journalist and author. The book, Disillusioned, 5 Families and the Unraveling of America's Suburbs. Benjamin Herold, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer.
Your show keeps me alive during the week. There's nobody I'd rather listen to between 5 and 9 in the morning than you guys.
On AM 560, The Answer.